Good afternoon. I'm Hale Esfandiari, the director of the Middle East program. I would like to welcome you all to today's meeting on Iran, Will Repression Succeed? We have three eminent speakers, people, all three know a lot about Iran, and it is a privilege having them here with us. We have distributed their bios, so I'm not going to take time in talking about their life stories, but to my right is Roberto Toscano, who is a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he was the former Italian ambassador to India and to Iran. And I always like to repeat this story that one of the first questions I was asked in prison in 2007 in Iran was, how well do I know Roberto Toscano? But, and in a way, I was maybe fortunate or unfortunate, fortunate then, unfortunate now looking back to say that I'd met him only once. So that closed that chapter at least. And then we have Shaul Bakhash, who is a former fellow at the Wilson Center, and he's Clarence J. Robinson Professor of History at George Mason University, and Ali Reza Nader, who is among the younger generation of Iranian scholar, and it always gives me a special pleasure when I have the young Iranian American scholars speaking for us. He is an international policy analyst at RAND Corporation, and ever since he has joined RAND, we get a lot of publication and wonderful research done by him. Shaul, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and thank you for coming. As I think we all know, before there was an Arab Spring, there was an Iranian Spring. And almost exactly 2 years ago, after contested and I think fraudulent elections in Iran, Iranians poured out into the streets in their hundreds of thousands to protest the elections. As we know, those protests were put down with great severity. A series of widespread arrests, show trials, coerced confessions, mistreatment in prison, even leading to death on a number of occasions, followed. And even today, this repression continues. The two principal leaders of the so-called opposition have been under house arrest and virtually incommunicado even to their own families for several months now. And I think there is enough credible report of deliberate mistreatment of men and women in prison, including rapes, to make clear that this is what will happen to you if you continue in dissent and opposition. When the Arab Spring came in January and March of this year, Tehran's streets were silent. And last week, or earlier this week, on the second anniversary of the 2009 protests, very little happened in Iran. This could lead to the conclusion that this is a case where repression has worked. On the other hand, it is hard to believe that a population which was so discontented and showed its discontent 2 years ago can be kept under wraps for a considerable length of time. This is the question, I think, before our two panelists today, and I will start with Roberto Toscano.
Thank you. Well, the bad news is that no democratic movement has ever prevailed against a unified armed force. I was in Santiago de Chile the 11th of September 1973 when there was a coup d'etat, as you might recall. And before that, there was a government in place with some with at least 40% of support in the population because they had recent elections. And the ultra-left, which was very critical of the Allende government because it was too moderate and it had chosen to be the peaceful way, the peaceful path to socialism, was also armed. You know, there was still this mythology of the guerrilla, of Castroism. Well, when the armed forces moved compact, there was no chance for anyone. Even the ultra-left, the Movimiento Izquierda Revolucionaria, just went into hiding, period. So this, I think, should be one consideration for those who are criticizing the moderates and those who do not want, you know, the real revolution and to confront with violence a violent regime. Second bad news is that if the armed forces are not unified, then you have civil war. And I don't think anybody in Iran is looking forward to a situation where there is civil war. I mean, civil war, I mean Libya today, to give you an idea. Of course, in Iran, when we say armed forces, we don't mean a normal army, normal armed forces. We're talking about the IRGC. We're talking about the Pasdaran. From a political point of view, the specific characteristic of that military corps is that it's very unlikely that they can be separated from the regime because they are a part of it. They are a component of it. They're not a tool. I mean, in Egypt, they could say, goodbye, Mubarak, you go, we stay. Or the same thing can be said about the intelligence. Don't forget what happened in the Soviet Union. The KGB abandoned communism, but didn't abandon its own power in society. The good news is that repression alone cannot guarantee the continuation of any regime. There was no regime in history, not even Adolf Hitler, who did not have a sizable amount of support. Which means that if the regime loses support to an extent that it has to rely only on repression, then its future looks very dim for the regime and very good for those who would like a different kind of political situation. Well, being Italian, you will understand that I like to quote an Italian author. I'm talking about Antonio Gramsci when he talks about hegemony. You know, political power can come from use of force, just mere force, but also from a concept that is related to culture, to ideas, to the prevalence of certain values or certain even ethical considerations and choices that are in contradiction with those that are imposed by a certain regime. And he also talks about something that's called passive revolution. Passive revolution meaning that something grows within a regime and which disqualifies it and which makes it lose its capacity to convince, not just to impose its own force. The short answer, therefore, on whether repression succeeds or not is that it does succeed in the short term, but usually does not succeed in the long term if the political mechanism that I described functions. For Iranian Democrats, therefore, I think there are two aspects of the same political strategy. The first one is to challenge the claims of the regime. Every regime is founded on certain claims, on something that it promises to deliver to the people, especially a regime that was born in a revolution. But the other aspect is, by you challenge those, let's say, promises or claims, and thereby you build an alliance with different segments of society which care about those claims and which feel that those claims have become sham, that somebody has been cheating them all along. Something like that is happening in Iran, I think. What are the basic claims of the regime? Well, Islamic Republic, religion. In which way can the claim of being a religious system? Well, I don't think it's too difficult. First of all, clericalism is not religion. In no religion. You can be clerical and cynical. You can be clerical and tied to power. You can be clerical and hypocritical and going against all the principles that you're preaching. Maybe that's the case. And maybe the Iranians, in their great majority, even very religious Iranians, have caught on that that is happening. Of course, if you confront religion, the religious power, by saying, we're going to be a secular republic like France or like Ataturk or like Reza Khan, I don't think that in that case there could be a majority of support for an alternative system to the present one. Therefore, I like to say that there is a possible secularism that's appealing to the great majority of Iranians, and it's like the American type of secularism or like the Indian type of secularism, meaning not against religion. One can be secular and believer. That is something that clericalists and fanatics try to deny and to hide. You can be anti-clerical, secularist, and believer. So I think anybody who wants the support of the majority of the Iranian population around the religious issue has to focus on that formula. I don't see any other one. This is my opinion. The second important claim of the revolution was social. The Iranian revolution was not a socialist revolution, but it definitely was a social revolution. Look at the Constitution. It says a lot about the needs of common people. Was it anything that was delivered there? Well, let's take a hard look at what happened. Is it charity or is it rights? If it's rights, then labor union leaders shouldn't be in jail. They are in jail. The real ones are in jail. Therefore, the link between the social and the political is evidently revealing that the system has not been run in order to favor the humble and the poor. There is a lot of rhetoric there, but it's very clear. It's very easy to see that it's more demagoguery than actual social policy. I remember once reading that when there was the new labor law was being discussed, the Council of Guardians tried to oppose it because it was too much in favor of the rights of workers, and they said that it was against Islam. Yes, of course. But therefore, are the capitalists happy? Because the promise was not to destroy or to fight against private enterprise. Look again at the Constitution. In Islam, incidentally, there is no great love for a centralized state as an ideology, but after all, the Prophet was a merchant also, right? So there is nothing against business in the ideology. But what kind of capitalism was created by the Islamic Republic? Crony capitalism, corporatist capitalism. Only those who are in good terms with the regime can prosper in business and in industry and so on and so forth. This is the other aspect. So whoever wants to propose an alternative to the present regime should address two aspects. First of all, a policy that addresses the need of common people in a more substantial, less rhetorical, less demagogic, more rights-based way than the present regime does. And second, leave space for real business. Real business, because the Iranians, and people will have noticed if you see what Iranians do when they settle in other countries, they have a talent for business, don't they? And if they were able to do it in their own country, the country would definitely prosper. But it's not going to be accepted if that sort of business approach forgets the other part, which, let's call it what it is, welfare. Iranians are not ready to abandon even the limited welfare that was introduced by the regime. Limited, distorted, inefficient, but still, they would like it to have something better than that. Last but not least, there was another promise in the revolution. National pride, national independence. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Is being isolated, is being in danger of military action or attack something that is achieving the goal of national interest? Is being isolated economically? Is not having the necessary investment to develop your energy resources and so on and so forth? Is that a great success? Or couldn't someone instead say, we share and we agree on national pride, on national independence, but there is another way, which makes of Iran not a pariah, an isolated country, a country that's the object of Security Council condemnation and so on and so forth, and it's an object of sanctions. But there is a way which, by maintaining the rights and the dignity of the country, achieves integration in the world economy and a role to play both regionally and internationally. All these things are there as a need, but I'm afraid that until now, they have not been explicitly addressed by those who until now say, this government, this regime is no good. But they can tend to stop there. I think Iranians need to know what the alternative proposals are, especially along these three lines. What kind of relationship with religion, what kind of social and economic system, and what kind of foreign policy. So there is a lot of work to do. But if you do that, then the process of building an alternative within the system, because there is no, as I said at the beginning, there is no possibility for a successful insurrection. And, you know, if I have understood anything in Iran, is that the 1980s created such a rejection of violence that in spite of the indignation, of the just indignation for the repression that's being administered, I don't think there are many in Iran who would be in favor of fighting violence with violence. This is my guess, but I think it has some reference in actual behavior and actual thought that's prevailing in Iran. Which subject can carry out this process of, it's a political construction, and not only political, it's political, cultural, ethical. It's happening, but I think the shift from civil society to politics is not automatic. You need leaders, you need organizations, you need platforms, and you need alliances. Right now, my impression is that the Green Movement is like a big, important, wide movement and a sort of container, but which includes, potentially, enough material to build at least a couple of political parties. There is an advantage in being united, but there is a disadvantage in not defining what you want. How far can you go facing a repressive regime? I believe that within the movement there should be an articulation of different options on all these three counts, because democracy doesn't mean that everybody has to believe the same. Some people will be more in favor of a religiously inspired government, some more secularist, some more social, some more free enterprise, some more nationalist, some more multilateralist. Fine, but that's what democracy is all about. Of course, within an alliance which has a point number one, enough with repression, enough with non-democracy. It's a very difficult passage, but if that doesn't happen, I'm afraid there will just be a cycle of protest repression, without really a realistic, positive outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Nader, I give the floor to you.
Is this on? All right. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to briefly talk about the use of repression in Iran. And when we look at Iran today, we see a country that's relatively quiet. The region around it has been transformed. The Arab uprisings have led to a lot of changes, not all positive, I would argue. But Iran is relatively quiet. We don't see a lot of public protests. The leadership of the Green Movement, the ostensible leadership of the Green Movement, is under house arrest. And the regime has really felt confident at the very top level. Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, has claimed that the Arab uprisings are a success for the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and that this is the downfall of U.S. influence in the region. But I think the reality is quite different. I think what we're witnessing in Iran today is really the calm before the storm. And there's three factors that explain why repression in Iran will not work in guaranteeing the regime. Number one is the ever-expanding public dissatisfaction with the system. The second one is internal divisions within the political system in Iran, and we see more of those every day. And the third is the lack of legitimacy. I think the Islamic Republic lacks legitimacy not only among the population but within the elite. The same forces that led to the creation of the Green Movement exist in Iran today. The Green Movement is not just about the fraudulent 2009 presidential election. It's more than that. If we look at Iran, there's a lot wrong with Iran today, whether it's unemployment, inflation, crime, corruption, sanctions, international pressure. I think the list goes on and on. And just because we don't see protests in the streets doesn't mean that the regime is necessarily stable, as some have argued. I think the biggest critical vulnerability the Iranian regime faces are the internal divisions. In 2009, the regime was successful in sidelining the reformists from power, including figures like Khatami, Mousavi, and Karoubi. They've also successfully sidelined Ayatollah Rafsanjani, the former president. Recently, he was forced to resign from his position at the Assembly of Experts. He was the chief. And there are even stories that he might be forced to resign from the Expediency Council, his remaining position. His family has been threatened. There was a video on YouTube showing pro-government thugs threatening his daughter. His son is in exile in London, etc. So Ayatollah Khamenei appears to believe that he has consolidated power. But I think he faces even a bigger challenge, and that challenge comes from his own president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, and his supporters. What is the source of this challenge? If you remember, Ahmadinejad fired the Minister of Intelligence, and Khamenei opposed this. And reportedly, Ahmadinejad went to Khamenei and said, I have 4 conditions. If you don't meet these conditions, I'm going to resign. And supposedly Khamenei said, go ahead and resign. And Ahmadinejad skipped his cabinet meetings for 10 or 11 days. And this was a big snub to the supreme leader. It was a major public challenge of the supreme leader. In a lot of ways, this was unprecedented in Iranian history and the history of the Islamic Republic. But the real cause of this is not just the issue over the Minister of Intelligence. It's this new political ideology that Ahmadinejad and his in-law, Mashai, who's also his chief of staff, are trying to fashion. This political ideology is really based on anti-clericalism and Iranian nationalism. And both Ahmadinejad and Mashai and a lot of their supporters realize that Iranians are tired of this system. They're tired of the clergy. They don't want this sort of rule anymore. So they're explicitly and implicitly challenging the clergy and Khamenei's legitimacy. The Islamic Republic is based on this idea of a walayat faqih, the rule of the supreme jurisprudent. So in Shia Islam, in the absence of the 12th Imam, the supreme leader is the intermediary between the people and the divine. He's supposed to be the guardian of the Iranian people and all Muslims, supposedly, in the absence of the 12th Imam. But Ahmadinejad and Mashai are saying something very different. Recently, this video came out in Iran called The Appearance is Eminent, the appearance of the 12th Imam. And this video claimed that Ahmadinejad was facilitating the emergence of the hidden Imam. So when you have Ahmadinejad playing this role of religious intermediary, what's the point of having the clergy? And I think this is why the clergy in Iran, the supreme leader, and even a lot of the revolutionary guards were really upset at Ahmadinejad. It wasn't just because of his public snub. It's creating this other space for politics within Iran. And also, Ahmadinejad has appealed to Iranian nationalism. I think it was a couple of years ago, President Putin of Russia came and visited Iran, and Ahmadinejad had this huge backdrop of Persian soldiers at Persepolis, which is a very nationalistic symbol, and the clergy doesn't like nationalism in Iran. It doesn't like nationalistic symbols. There was even discussion of raising Persepolis, the ancient capital, after the revolution. So this was provocative. This past Nowruz, or the New Year, Ahmadinejad wanted to celebrate, or the Iranian government wanted to have festivals at Persepolis. Again, this was a point of controversy. So interestingly, although Ahmadinejad and the Green Movement are opposed to each other, they're trying to appeal to the same constituents in a lot of ways. The urban classes that tend to be secular and nationalistic. Again, another reason why Ahmadinejad got into trouble. And what's the reason for these challenges to Khamenei as supreme leader? Khamenei has always lacked legitimacy, and the religious credentials that were possessed by his predecessor, Ayatollah Khomeini. I think the two leaders are seen very differently, not just by the public, but the elite as well, including the clergy. Khomeini was somebody who could unite the various factions of the Iranian political system, whether they were on the left or on the right. He was basically the father of the revolution. The position of the supreme leader was created for him. But Khamenei is very different. I think in a lot of ways he's a very hardcore politician. He hasn't tried to stay above the political fray like Khomeini. And Khomeini did this at least in public. He played the role of this arbitrator, although he may have supported one side or another on specific issues. Khamenei over the years has really supported the Islamist right spectrum of the political system. When it suited his interests, he supported Ahmadinejad in 2005 and again in 2009. And this has really been bad for his image, because in 2009, he said that Ahmadinejad is a legitimate president of Iran. But if you look at what's going on in Iran today, that doesn't seem like the case. There are talks of him resigning or being replaced by the supreme leader. So Iranians have stopped believing in him as an arbitrator. And by doing this, Khamenei has weakened the Republican features of the system. Because when you look at the Islamic Republic and its constitution, it derives legitimacy from walayat faqih, or from divine authority, but also elections and Republican institutions. After the election, Ayatollah Rafsanjani made a speech his Friday prayer speech, which I think was attended by 1 million people. And he said, let's not forget, this is the Islamic Republic. The Republican characteristics of the system are as important as the religious. And if we don't have this will basically weaken the system. But instead, Khamenei has really relied on this vast network of patronage and repression that he has built for himself. And he has relied on the Revolutionary Guard specifically to enforce it. So this system doesn't have a lot of legitimacy. And what happens when a system doesn't have a lot of legitimacy? It's in danger. If we look at Mubarak's Egypt, there was nothing holding that country together ideologically. Nasserism, Pan-Arabism was history at that point. If you look at Syria, Baathism is no longer a valid ideology. Even the elite within that country don't necessarily believe in the system anymore. So once the system loses legitimacy, it's in danger of being overthrown. But I don't think that Iran will necessarily look like Egypt or Tunisia, that if there is change in Iran, it will not necessarily be peaceful. Iran may look more like Libya or Syria more than Egypt or Tunisia. And this is because within this system, we have factions, personalities, groups that are in heated competition with each other. And they all have a different vision for the Islamic Republic. The Green Movement has the support of a significant segment of the population. I still do think Khamenei has his core supporters, and also he has a lot of support from within the Revolutionary Guards on the top level. And Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards are not the type that are going to give up power easily. They're going to go out with a fight. I have a hard time imagining if there's any sort of disturbance in Iran that Khamenei will negotiate his exit with the United States or any other power, because where does he really have to go? Who's really going to take him in? Syria, but Bashar Assad might be in Tehran tomorrow. So this is deeply problematic for him. And even the Revolutionary Guards is not a monolithic force. There are divisions within the Guards. After the election, even the head of the Guards, General Jafari, admitted that there are those within the Guards that support the Green Movement, that when touring the barracks of the Revolutionary Guards and the regular military, soldiers had the pictures of Mousavi and Karoubi on their walls. So again, this is not a monolithic system, and the armed forces and the security forces are not monolithic. Having said that, I do think that Iran has the ingredients for democracy. It has a history of democracy going back to the 1905 constitutional revolution. There's a vigorous women's rights movement in Iran. There's still some civil society. The Republican ideals that have even existed under the Islamic Republic. So today, democracy in Iran is a real possibility, but so is instability, violence, and bloodshed in the streets. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we have two, I think, well, I would say contrasting but different aspects of the situation in which Iran finds itself. I think, to summarize Roberto Toscani's interesting presentation, that a successful insurrection in Iran is not possible because the army remains united. It's not a typical military force, and is very united with the regime. That the opposition, if it wishes to be successful, has to develop a alternative program that addresses the issues of the place of religion and secularism in Iran, a stronger case for social justice, and a stronger case for independence and nationalism, but along with integration into the international community. I think I'm right, Roberto, in saying that your view is that you don't yet see this in the leadership of the opposition. They haven't yet developed such a agenda or a platform or a statement of position, and they need to do that if they're going to succeed. And as you put it very well, I think, is that the shift from civil society to politics is not automatic. You need to really work at it. I think Nader presented somewhat different view, which is his focus on the regime's weaknesses and the lack of legitimacy, he said, similar to the loss of legitimacy by the regime in Egypt or Syria. And he thinks, therefore, the regime is in danger, that it can be overthrown, but that the result will be more like Libya because of the factionalism inside the country on the regime than like Egypt or Tunisia. Well, I'm allowed as chair to pose the first question. So I'd like to ask Roberto, why do you think, I mean, it's a question that puzzles me, and therefore I'm interested in the answer. Why, since the agenda for the opposition in a way is so clear, that we don't find the opposition leaders doing what you suggest they need to do? Yes? And to Nader, I would like to ask how you reconcile your view that democracy, or the ingredients for democracy, exist in Iran, and your view that Iran is likely to be more like Libya, where there's virtually civil war, than to Egypt, where we are beginning to see a transition to something that is more democratic. So, Roberto.
Well, I will try to answer your question. There is a reason. The reason is double. First of all, you can explain it by who those leaders of the Green Movement are. And second, by who the people in the streets are. First part, at least at the beginning of their political attempt to introduce a new reformism after the substantial failure of Khatami, they can be classified, or could be classified, as neo-Khomeinist. I like to draw the parallel of those communists who, when the communist system started showing its the lack of growth and hegemony, they said Stalin was terrible, but Lenin was good. I think that that's the way they started out. I think also that after the repression, maybe they're revising that neo-revolutionary approach, and they might be shifting to a different. But the most important reason is that if they were to define their platform, you wouldn't have 3 million people joining them. 3 million people are there because they're indignant. They say, where is my vote? But where is my vote? You can be somebody who's in favor of the Islamic Revolution and still ask, where is my vote? You can be, so this political spectrum that's represented by 3 million people is this wide. If you start defining yourself, it shrinks. So this is the real problem.
As I said, I think Iran has ingredients for democracy, but there's nobody in Iran who can articulate what democracy could and should look like. We have the Green Movement and the leadership of the Green Movement. It's not even clear if the leadership exercises that much authority, but let's say that they do. There are inherent contradictions within this leadership. For example, Mousavi was Khomeini's prime minister. He was his right-hand man. He was prime minister when thousands of Iranian prisoners were executed. He's committed to the system. Yet at the same time, he talks about free elections. I'm not sure if those two ideals can coexist in Iran today. The Green Movement says that they want the constitution implemented, for example, but the constitution in Iran is inherently anti-democratic. It has democratic elements, but those elements have never been really enforced. So when we look at the political system in Iran, there are no secular parties. The Green Movement, again, the leadership likes to claim some affinity with secularism, perhaps to satisfy a segment of the Iranian population. But I question how serious they are. And so when you have this system, when there's no viable opposition, when even the opposition is in a lot of ways part of the system, and when you can't solve your differences in a peaceful manner through electoral politics, I think violence is more likely. Now, I'm not saying that Iran will look exactly like Libya or Syria. I hope it doesn't. I hope that doesn't happen to Iran. But you can see indicators of that already because of the tensions within the system. We saw a lot of violence in 2009. Recently, there have been reports of clashes between Ahmadinejad's supporters and Khamenei supporters in the city of Shiraz. One of the Revolutionary Guards commanders has even warned that during the next parliamentary elections next year, there will be blood in the streets. So people in Iran are thinking that far, that if our interests are in danger, we will use even additional force. And I think looking at the parliamentary election in 2012 and the presidential election in 2013, there's real potential for violence. Perhaps after this period, you can see in Iran that emerges, an Iran that's more secular or democratic, but I think at this point, that may be wishful thinking. As long as the supreme leader is alive in power, I don't think you're going to have fundamental changes in Iran in a peaceful manner.
Thank you. I'll open the question to the floor for questions. Hale.
Oops. Thank you very much for both your presentation. A question to Roberto. You were in Iran during part of the Khatami period, and then afterward also, and you got a chance to talk to him at great length after he had left the presidency. Why do you think, or did this come up in your discussion, why he failed? I mean, did you discuss with him, or what is your impression that there was a quest for democratization? And so that's to you. And then to Ali Reza Nader, my question is that we heard, and there are no statistics for it, that during the elections that led to Khatami's presidency, we are told that a number of the rank and file and revolutionary guards, and they were, some would say 40%, 30%, 50%, voted for him. So what happened to that group? And in 2009, did they vote? Do we know whether they voted for Mousavi? But then why did they come out with such a vengeance in carrying on the repression and in the streets of Tehran? And I'm a bit concerned with one of your statements that you made, that you said Ahmadinejad appeals to the same people that the Green Movement appeals. Thank you.
Well, my meetings with former President Khatami did not go into political details, but I will give you my impression in general of why political history in Iran developed in a way that the original project of Khatami's reform didn't succeed. Although without Khatami, there wouldn't have been people in the streets in 2009, because he wasn't able to change the system, but he introduced demands, concepts, problems, a different political culture. That was essential. So let's recognize what has to be recognized. But then there are the limits. The limits are of different kinds. First of all, he would have been a great president in a country with a prime minister. He's not a politician in the sense that to go beyond the framing of general principles, which are important, and then translate them into tough political action. So this is it. And besides, we shouldn't ask of Khatami to be what he is not. We say reformist, but what is a reformist? Is a reformist somebody who wants to replace a system by another system? That's a revolutionary. A reformist wants to extract the best out of a given system. And this is what he tried and didn't succeed. So let's, he didn't claim that he wanted to abolish the Islamic Republic, quite the opposite. Incidentally, Mousavi either. But then there is a political limitation and shortcoming of the reformists as such. Their limitation is that basically they were a middle-class phenomenon, and to a certain extent still are. If they don't make the connection to a more general constituency, then the space will be left for populism, and I'm afraid also can be defined as fascism. Because, there is democratic nationalism and there is fascist nationalism. There is secularist religion and fundamentalist religion. There is crony capitalism and market capitalism. There is charity and there is social rights. It's true that apparently Ahmadinejad and his people identify the same issues, but they give exactly the opposite reply as compared to the democratic reply. But the issues are identified also by Ahmadinejad, incidentally. So I share many of the criticism that is framed for Khatami and his... But I'm not so harsh because he never promised what he didn't deliver. The question is there a space for reformism in such a system? That's another question.
There are indeed reports that a lot of the Revolutionary Guard supported Khatami and voted for him, and it's hard to come up with numbers. It's a lot of this is anecdotal information, but during the 2009 election, there were reports of Revolutionary Guards officers who were supportive of Mousavi, including some of the top leaders of the Guards. Again, it's very hard to prove this, but if we look at Mousavi, he was prime minister during the Iran-Iraq War. He built relations with a lot of the Guards commanders. He was seen as a technocratic leader and quite able in navigating Iran through a very difficult period. So there's respect for him within the system. That's one of the reasons he was a candidate, because the reformists thought he would be more presentable than Khatami. Right after the election, I've heard this, that a lot of the Guards and the Basij didn't even know what to do. They basically wanted to see which direction events took Iran, that they weren't necessarily in favor of cracking down too harshly on Iranians. And the Revolutionary Guards did crack down on the population harshly. But again, there are reports that the law enforcement forces, the regular law enforcement, wasn't willing to beat up protesters, that a lot of the Basij, instead of beating up protesters, ran away with their equipment. And that the Guards were unhappy with the results of the election. I've also heard that the regime even had to hire non-governmental thugs to beat up people. They would pull people aside in the streets and give them money and ask them to go beat up people. So I think that's a concern the regime has, that any regime in the Middle East has, actually, that the security forces are not going to follow commands. And there have been reports from Syria that there is friction within the armed forces there, and this is basically typical of a lot of these authoritarian regimes that lack legitimacy. On the second question, I don't think Ahmadinejad appeals to secular and nationalist Iranians. He thinks he might. But knowing those types of Iranians, I don't think they would really like Ahmadinejad very much, just based on his politics, appearance, etc. So I think Ahmadinejad and Mashhad have been overconfident in thinking that they have this base of support within the Iranian population that they can use to challenge the supreme leader. I don't think they have as big a base. I mean, Ahmadinejad's problem has always been overconfidence, basically. He has thought that just because he's the president, that he goes on TV and is interviewed on CNN, that he's a very consequential figure. And when we saw that a lot of figures within the Islamic Republic attacked him very harshly, some even threatening him, some of the lower religious leaders threatening him with arrest and violence. Going back to this issue of Khatami, it's not that Khatami made unrealistic promises. I think what he did was he raised Iranians' hopes as posed as a figure who could really reform Iran. And a lot of it perhaps was not intentional. But I think Khatami should also be critiqued because it's never clear which side he stands on, what his policies are. After the presidential election, 2009, he wasn't as vigorous in his denunciations of the regime. If you look at Karoubi went much further than Khatami in criticizing the supreme leader, criticizing the system, saying the Islamic Republic was even worse than the Shah's regime, etc. Recently, Khatami made a statement saying that the regime should forgive the people. And he came under a lot of criticism for this by his own supporters even. So we have to ask, what exactly does he have in mind? What does the regime, what have Iranians done that the regime has to forgive them? And of course, a lot of this is because of politics, because of Ahmadinejad's weakening position. I think Khatami sees an opening for the reformists. But again, it's not clear what the reformists or the Green Movement in Iran intend to do. Participate in elections? How? When the Iranian government has said they can't participate in elections, what is really their intention? What is their objective? What's their future vision for Iran? Those are some of the answers they have to provide.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Yeah.
Just wait for the mic, please.
My question goes to Mr. Toscano. You mentioned about leadership in Green Movement, and I see that the
Into the mic, please.
And I see the board is looking at the Green Movement steps. What's its reaction? What's its step toward the government? But I'd like to know what you predict for a movement without leadership. I know that Iran has been never predictable, but what do you imagine for a movement without leadership?
Yeah. Well, some people say that it's good that there are no leaders, that the Iranians are fed up with, the leaders that replace, in a way, the people. Maybe it's true for the first phase that, yes, when 3 million people can go to the streets and protest against the government, you don't need a leader. But once you want to translate that into political alternative, you need institutions, meaning parties, you need leaders, you need alliances. So I think this is a very temporary situation. Either it will turn into a more political approach, or it will wither away. So we will see. The Iranians will have to decide themselves, of course.
Please, yeah, down at the bottom there.
Hi, thank you. It's been brought up before in this conversation and in previous ones that members of the Green Movement and the opposition didn't really present a clear plan to the populace, okay? to swipe an image from American politics, what if they were like the Tea Party and said, we have a manifesto. These are the things that we consider to be objectives. These are the things that we want for the Iranian people. If such a document or if such an articulation was constructed and presented to the people, would there be any traction? What do you see there? Would there be something for them to bite onto and hold and to work for? What would be the benefit of that? Or would there be a benefit of an articulation, as I brought up? Anything?
Well, you can avoid doing that, but as I said, then where do you go? Because people today want to know, where are we going? Where do you propose us to go? And this has not been done. The critical part against the regime is there, and it's very important, but it's stage one. Stage two is positive. We are this. We want this. And it hasn't been done so far.
Well, if they did do something like that,
the price to pay would be you don't have 3 million people with you.
Good. Microphone here, please.
I have a question of Mr. Nader. You mentioned that it's inevitable that Iran, at some point, there are indicators that it would go towards violence. And the scenario could be like Libya. I'm wondering if there would be a coalition, just like it is now with Libya, and the United States would get involved. How would that play with the Iranian people? And in light of the publications that you've had with what do Iranians think, I wanted to know what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's inevitable that Iran will go through violence on the scale of Libya or Syria. I just think there's a lot of potential for it. But if there is such an event where there's some sort of civil conflict in Iran or civil war, I think having an international coalition could be very difficult. Intervention in Iran, I think, would be resented by the population overall, because Iran is different than countries like Libya or Syria or Egypt in some ways. It has, I think, a longer tradition as a nation state in some ways than Libya anyways. So there's this feeling of nationalism. And I think looking at Iran, one of the forces that unifies Iranians is this sense of nationhood and nationalism. And the Islamic Republic has been, to some extent, successful in exploiting this. And when you look at the nuclear program, I would argue a lot of Iranians might actually see sanctions and international pressure and threats of force as not just targeting the regime, but them as a people. And the Iranian government has done a relatively good job in selling the nuclear program to the population as a civilian program. Iranians view this very differently than we do in Washington, D.C., for example, where our focus is, when is Iran going to get a nuclear bomb? Is it going to be 2 months? Is it going to be 2 years, et cetera? I don't think that's necessarily how it's seen in Iran for various reasons, but the fact that the government controls the information environment has been able to shape the public's perception. And that's why you have people like Ahmadinejad resorting to the nuclear program as a political strategy. Because if you look at Ahmadinejad, he hasn't had a lot of economic and political successes, I would argue. And so he can point to the nuclear program as being one of his successes. And this resonates to some extent among Iranians.
Your question here, please.
To ask this question from Mr. Toscano. Actually, you mentioned the name of Antonio Gramsci, and he's also talking about the southern problem in Italy. I'd like to know, during the years that you were in Iran, what was your impression? Do you see, the southern, problem kind of very similar to the, the Italian case that was actually, I mean, in Antonio Gramsci's, and I believe it was one of the main, obstacles to a democratic Italy.
Yes, the question, because somebody hasn't heard, since I quoted Gramsci, he wanted to, the question is whether I see any parallel between the Southern question, which had a very profound impact in Italian political history, and something comparable in the Iranian case. I would say no, in the sense that Iran is not distinguished by, a developed north and an underdeveloped south. The problem is the peripheral areas, which is slightly different, because also there is an ethnic component, and in the Gulf also a religious component, which was totally absent in Italy. So I wouldn't draw too many parallels there.
Question there.
Hi. It was said that the IRGC is, too much part of this regime, that it cannot be broken away as far as supporting any future uprising. I'm wondering if the IRGC doesn't maybe believe in the ideology underpinning the regime, is there some way to appeal to their even economic interests to say, after the dust settles, you'll get to retain your industries, or is there some way, or is there just absolutely none?
I remember when I was in Iran, especially in the latter part, meaning between 2000, around before the 2005 elections, there were people, liberals, Democrats, who said, I wish somebody would get rid of these clerics, even the military. And I like to quote a dissident journalist who once said, if we're lucky, we will become like Turkey is today, meaning there is a religious a party in government, but it's modern, it's democracy, close relation with the West. He said, but probably we'll have to go through what Turkey was yesterday, meaning military government, to get rid of the control by the clergy. Today, after seeing that the shift from the hegemony of the clergy to the RGC, it's not such a big deal. I think that the same person wouldn't think the same today. Because, it is true that economic interests are very, very important. But I am afraid that the RRGC doesn't see a guarantee of a continuation of its own, even economic interest, without the regime. Because without the regime, probably a more normal capitalist system will arise. And both the IRGC and the bonyads will not be what they are today.
I'd like to address that as well. I think the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, is the regime in a lot of ways. It has supplanted the clergy as Iran's dominant governing authority. If you look at the Revolutionary Guards, they're the biggest economic player in Iran. They control most of the security and the national security and foreign policy decisions. Khamenei has surrounded himself with Revolutionary Guards figures. His closest advisors are the Revolutionary Guards. I think you ask a very good question. Could they be influenced by profit motivations? Are they willing to back down or make compromises if their economic interests are in jeopardy? And I think this is a possibility, but because of this system of crony capitalism, the Revolutionary Guards are actually benefiting by Iran's isolation to some extent. As long as there are oil revenues, the Revolutionary Guards are not in great danger. And they do need the regime, and the regime meaning the supreme leader right now, to have formed this symbiotic relationship. Khamenei is still Iran's most powerful person, but I don't think he'd be that powerful if the guards didn't back him the way they do. So it'd be interesting to see what happens after Khamenei leaves the scene, how the Revolutionary Guards react, whether they're willing to take over the system completely or allow some level of economic and political reforms.
Question here in front, please, and then one here.
My question is for Mr. Toscano, and of course I'll be interested to hear Mr. Nader's thoughts as well. Mr. Toscano, how do you think outside repression, particularly by the United States and other Western powers, affects the state of repression in Iran? And how do measures like sanctions, be it human rights or against Iran's nuclear program, affect Iranian civil society and organic movements like the Green Movement?
It's a very good question and a very important one, because we are often in a quandary, especially facing a country which is characterized by national pride, national interest. There are times when you think that not exerting pressure is condoning the regime, but exerting pressure might be doing a favor to the regime which claims that they're defending the nation as such. So this claim has to be deconstructed, especially not essentially by Iranians themselves, to say, are you working in the interest of the country or not? And it can be done by differentiating the issues. I am sure that Iranians will agree, the great majority of Iranians will agree, that something like Holocaust denial is not in the national interest, besides being not corresponding to the general feelings of the population, for instance. But when you talk about the nuclear issue, then it becomes very difficult for anybody to say that not having an independent nuclear energy source is not in the national interest. So it will have to be differentiated. If I say so, it's because, for instance, when sanctions were extended to people in Iran who are the prosecutors, if not the torturers, and the violators of human rights, people in Iran, Democrats in Iran, were very happy, because the nagging suspicion is if this government gives enough guarantee on strategic issues, they will abandon us. I mean, our friends outside. After all, wasn't it what happened basically on China? If there is an agreement on international matters, security, economy, then human rights is no longer in the forefront, is it? So if we want to appeal and to show and to prove that we care about the conditions of Iranians in Iran, then we should focus our attention not only on strategic and economic matters, but also on human rights.
Thank you. My question is to Mr. Nader. Considering the uprising and upheavals in Syria, and considering that it's one of the closest allies to Iran, so what do you think if we assume that Assad regime will be toppled in the following weeks? How would be the political dynamics and the geopolitical posture of Iran will change? Thank you.
I think the Assad regime's toppling would be really bad for Iran. Syria is Iran's only real ally in the region. In a lot of ways, it's only real ally in the entire world. The two depend on each other. The relations between the two have really strengthened over the last 10 years or so, where Iran is providing training and equipment to the Syrian armed forces and investing heavily in the Syrian economy. Iran has used Syria to empower Hezbollah in Lebanon, and where it has gained a lot of influence. And a lot of its claims as a regional power are based on that. So if Assad falls, I think this is a major trouble for the Iranian government. We hear reports today of Iran helping the Syrian regime in its crackdowns. There are not that many details, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're giving them some degree of assistance. But at the same time, Hezbollah is still powerful in Lebanon, and we don't know what's going to happen with the Syrian regime. So I think it's too early to tell, but I think if there's this potential of Syria falling, it could have a domino effect that's negative for the Islamic Republic and the wider Middle East.
Thank you. Bill Miller.
To turn the question around slightly, you've said that the Green Revolution would have been impossible without Khatami. It raises the question, is the regime capable of reforming itself in the light of the experience of Khatami and the Green Revolution? Is it broad enough and to be inclusive of the wishes of the constituents, the 3 million that you speak of?
Yes, well, this is also a very, very important question. Probably everything is a question of time. let's say that the communist system could have entered a reformist mode around the Prague Spring in '68, or Eurocommunism. But after that, any attempt at reforming the system, well, you don't revive a dead body. And ideologically, I was in the Soviet Union in the second half of the '70s, and I can tell you that ideologically it was already dead before being dead as a system. This is what I'm saying. Regimes probably die ideologically and lose their capacity to convince the great majority of the people before they actually leave the scene. As for the possibility to reform the system, unfortunately, the regime, in a way, the regime should have been in favor of reform, allowing the regime to continue in a different shape and form. But first of all, their interests were not coinciding with that. And second, they know their history too. They know that reforms turns into regime change from the inside. There was reform in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was a reformist at the beginning, but then he presided over the demise of the system. And Adolfo Suarez in Spain was a reformist of the Franco system. Guess what? The Franco system ended. So the dynamics between reform and regime change are well known historically, and even in Tehran they know that.
Wasn't there a question here somewhere? Anyone? Yeah, sorry, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. It's a question for Ambassador Toscano. It's very much in the line you were answering now. I liked very much your mentioning Gramsci, the creation of a kind of hegemonic bloc of alternative values, culture, based as well in a secular Islam, which I appreciate this vision. I'm following as well the question of the previous gentleman about the possibility of the regime not reforming himself, but to the other. I mean, comparing as well with the Suarez case, I think this regime has. I mean, is my idea to be an Islamic republic, maybe a Turkish way out, but maybe with the aid of the elaboration or in construction of other values. Do you think in the long future any possibility? I'm not talking about reformist, about surviving of democracy and building a new so-called Islamic republic. I don't know.
Well,
thank you.
Yes, the country I saw in 2003 when I arrived was definitely not a democracy, but there were elements of democracy. So the hope of the reformists was that of expanding the Republican, meaning the democratic and liberal component, and gradually having, maybe even without changing the name. After all, the Chinese still call themselves communists, don't they? And capitalist communism is very interesting. So you can call it Islamic Republic and be secular. That's not a problem of name. Maybe you can establish a pseudo-continuity. People tend to need that, Okay, but the importance is the substance. If the citizens are free, if there is real political competition and so forth. But as was said before by Nader, the real stumbling block is the presence of the supreme leader. Velayat Faqih is not compatible with any sort of democracy, gradual, partial, whatever. The only hope, we talk about the demise, looking at the constitution, the Iranian constitution, you see the possibility of replacing the supreme leader with a collegiate, with a council, another council. That would make a huge difference, and that is not ruled out because it would be very difficult for the regime to find a replacement. They already went one step down from Khomeini to Khamenei. They cannot go another step down.
Actually, Roberto, the revised constitution doesn't allow for succession by a council. It has to be...
It says temporary.
Yes, in the transition between two supreme leaders.
Yeah,
it
but
could be
it doesn't say how long.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. There seems to be some confusion here because there's talk of a regime and as if it's monolithic, and yet you're describing a system in which is hardly monolithic, in which there's a lot of competition, there are opposition parties and so on. No one has talked about the parliament yet. So why can't a system like this gradually, just like the United States, which also has a very messy form of politics with competition and division of powers, why can't it generally reform itself? It seems to me that when you talk about the Revolutionary Guard, on the one hand you're suggesting it's monolithic, but also you're indicating that very clearly they are on different, all across the political spectrum. It seems to me that, there are regular elections and presidents are term limited and so on. It seems to me that the jump to some kind of reform would not be that difficult. In the end, the clergy, the clerics seem to, their time has passed, but they don't know it yet.
Can I give it a try? Theoretically, it was possible. But in practice, because that was the original idea of reformism, actually, it is true that in spite of the existence of the supreme leader, the system has been more like an oligarchy, meaning several centers of power. But recently, after 2009, something has happened. The mediator entered, the referee started playing for a team. And that unbalanced the system. And I don't think there is a way back from that. And therefore, without a mediator, without the respect of certain rules of the game within the oligarchy, it's up for grabs. And so the possibility of a harmonious evolution, to me, is not visible now.
Aris, do you want to address whether this is a monolithic or a fragmented system?
I think it's both. I don't even think the Islamic Republic knows what it is. Because Khamenei has constitutional authority and supposedly divine authority, but everybody challenges him. This president is supposed to be the second most powerful person. For a while he is, for a while he's not. Parliament is supposed to be a key player. It is a key player when Khamenei wants it to be a key player. It's not when the reformists are in power. So I think the Islamic Republic is a very confusing and confused political system. I think you have a house that's really divided against itself. And that is one of its major weaknesses, that it's not cohesive. It can't speak with one voice. And I do think if the supreme leader went away or passed from the scene, this could all collapse. That basically the different factions and power centers would compete with each other. But as long as Khamenei, the person of Khamenei is in power, I don't see a political evolution because Khamenei is just not that type of person. I mean, if you listen to all his speeches, he's very set on his ideology, how things should be. He doesn't have the system as a whole in consideration. What matters to him is his personal power and his network's power. And so any type of reform is a threat to him. I think one of the reasons he really supported Ahmadinejad wasn't so much because he liked him necessarily. He just didn't want a reformist like Mousavi to be president. And the 2009 election was bad for him because it made him look bad, but he thinks in a very short-term manner. As long as Mousavi doesn't become president, things are okay. And then he has to improvise. Once Ahmadinejad gets out of control, he has to basically cap him in the knee. And this is a system that doesn't have very set political institutions. It doesn't have norms and rules like a lot of developed countries in the United States where you have formal politics as well as informal politics. I think politics in Iran, to a large extent, is very informal and a day-to-day matter. You make up a strategy as you go along.
Yes, one last question then. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Nader, you talk a lot about the internal divisions, and particularly recently between Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader. I wonder if you think that this is an opportunistic time for other factions or for diplomacy, or if you think that this actually works against diplomacy and could be more of a distraction.
I think it could present opportunities for the Green movement, people like Rafsanjani, but their opportunities are limited. I think Khamenei doesn't really want him involved in the system. I think Khamenei had a large role in pushing Rafsanjani to the side. In terms of opportunities for the United States, I think that's a very good question. I think Iran is going to follow keep developing the nuclear program. I don't think it's necessarily going to come to the negotiation table. So Ahmadinejad being weakened, I don't think has a lot of impact on the issue that really makes up U.S. Foreign policy toward Iran, and that's the nuclear program. The Supreme Leader and some of the top figures within the system, including the Revolutionary Guards, most likely make those decisions, not Ahmadinejad. So I think the opportunity for the United States is if it pursues a containment policy against Iran, that helps the United States because the internal divisions will keep Iran from projecting a lot of power in the Middle East and beyond. And I think at times Iran's power is wildly exaggerated in this country. It's not as powerful as we think it is. It's a very vulnerable and weak system in many ways. It has the potential to do harm and to damage U.S. interests, but it's not an omnipotent power in the Middle East challenging us in every corner.
Good. Well, it's left for me to thank both our speakers for their interesting presentations and to all of you for being here. Thank you.